Chapter 12 Feast Night. Dune sat glumly on an old armchair that smelled of ashes, and watched as Minnie worked on the fire. She scraped at it with a rake that must have come from one of the greenhouses, pulling coals toward the rod they'd set up over the 2 stacks of stones. Every time she came near Dune, she skittered past without looking at him, as if she was afraid he might stick his legs out and trip her. She fluttered her hands, patted her chest, and plucked at the hair at the back of her neck. She was the most nervous, twittery person Dune had ever seen. Trog directed her with the waves of his arms and shouts. "More fuel over there! Bank it up here! Quicker, Minnie! Stop flittering!" Behind Minnie, the lame boy drifted silently around, fetching and carrying when she told him to. "What's his name?" Dune asked Trog, pointing to the boy. "Scargo," said Trog. "He had another name, but I changed it to go with the names of my kids." He turned away from the fire and planted himself in front of Dune. "See, I picked up a lot of information about the ancient world in my time. Want to know anything? Just ask me. I named my kids after ancient cities. There was New York, and there was Kansas City, and there was Scargo. Of course, lots of others, but I liked the sound of those. Gave my wife a new name, too. She used to be Cora. Now she's Minnie, after a city called Minneapolis. In those ancient places, Druid," he said, "there was power. I honor power. I draw it toward me, as I am a naturally powerful person." He stood tall and puffed his chest out. "I chose my own name," he said, "from the most powerful city of all, Washington." Dune remembered looking at the map in the book Edward Pocket had shown him. He was pretty sure that Trog didn't have the names of the cities quite right. "In a book I read," he said, but Trog interrupted him. "Oh, books," said Trog, "used to be very useful." "Yes," said Dune. "So, if you looked in this book, you could see that those cities' names were actually—"
"I mean, useful for fuel," Trog said. "Pretty much gone now, though. We burned them up ages ago, where I come from."
"Burn them up?" Dune was horrified. "Why?"
"Because what's the point of them? Full of squiggles. People have a lot more important things to deal with than figuring out squiggles. Matters of survival, Drune."
"But in books, you can find out what people have discovered. You can find out how things work, and—" Trog pointed a finger at Dune.
"You listen to me," he said. "We know how things work. We don't need any squiggles to tell us. We don't need any squiggles to tell us."
"But if you just even read the names of the cities—" Dune began.
"We don't read," said Trog shortly. "So quit yapping about it. We don't approve of reading. We stopped doing it long ago. It's a useless trick. Everything we need to know came down to us from our fathers and our grandfathers and their fathers before them."
Dune understood. Where Trog came from, people didn't know how to read. He blinked in amazement, but he didn't say any more about it. Minnie bent over the pot of water, poking a long fork at the potatoes boiling in there. She seemed to be afraid of Dune. When he clanked over to look at what she was cooking, she edged away from him, her hand fluttering at her throat, her face turned away. Dune went back to the smelly armchair and sat down to wait. Trog bent over a box of stuff near the fire and burrowed through it, tossing things out left and right, muttering ferociously.
"It's not here,"
he said at last, resting back on his heels.
"Minnie, where's that little bottle of salt?"
Minnie and Scargo were sitting facing each other, with a short board between them on which they were chopping up some soggy-looking onions. She glanced up at Trog with tears dripping from her eyes and said, "It's upstairs, husband, in the kitchen."
"We need it,"
Trog said, glaring at her and Scargo.
"Of course," said Minnie. "We'll just put this down. Don't let that onion roll off, Scargo. Hold the board steady. Oops, the knife is sliding."
"Never mind," Trog bellowed. "I'll send the new boy.
He turned to Dune and stared hard at him. "Go upstairs," he said. "Get the little green bottle from the table in the kitchen. Do not even think about touching anything else. You will be searched when you return." So Dune hobbled off toward the apartment and climbed the stairs, his chain clanking the whole way. He found the bottle of salt on the table and put it into his pocket. Now, he was alone. No one was watching him. There must be some way he could use this moment. Could he go out a back window? But with his feet chained, he wouldn't be able to land right. The 2-story drop would probably break his ankles or wrists. Could he steal something useful? Some kind of weapon? A knife? A hammer? But Trog was going to search him. He'd find it right away. What else? What else? Dune swept his eyes around the apartment. The main room with its beds and couches and armchairs all crowded together at crazy angles. The kitchen with dirty mugs standing on the table and smeared spoons and the cabinets full of bottles and cans. A thought came to him. The kitchen was where Trog had stashed Skago's treasures. Up high somewhere. If Dune couldn't help himself here, maybe he could help the boy. Quickly he flung open the doors of all the upper cabinets to see what was on their top shelves. Nothing in the first one, nothing in the second. But in the third, he saw a cloth sack way up on an otherwise empty shelf near the ceiling. He'd have to guess that it held Skago's little collection. He dragged a chair over to the kitchen counter. If his feet hadn't been chained, he could easily have stepped onto the chair and from there to the counter. But the chain made it impossible to separate his feet enough to get one of them onto the chair at a time. So, with both hands on the counter, he hoisted himself up, bending his knees until his feet rested on the chair's seat. When he stood up and raised an arm, he found the top shelf still out of reach. He turned with small, clanking steps, sat on the counter, swung his feet up, and with some difficulty stood up again. This time, stretching his arm high, he managed to grab the sack with 2 fingers. He pulled on it and caught it as it fell. Once he was down again, he took just enough time for one glimpse inside the sack. He saw something glittery and some papers, to feel sure enough that he'd got the right thing. Then he crossed the room with it and pushed the sack deep under the striped couch. Back down the stairs, the quickest way was to sit down and slide, and out to the fire, where he handed Trog the salt bottle.
"Took you a while,"
Trog said. "Chained feet," said Dune. "You should try it." Trog patted him all over to make sure he hadn't stolen anything, and Dune sat down in the smelly chair and continued to wait for dinner. Finally, on Gilly Street, he saw the 2 lights that meant Yorick and Kanza were coming back. It was clear from their excited cries that whatever they'd brought with them was dinner.
"We got it, Pa!"
Yorick exclaimed as they pulled the wagon up close.
"It was just there where it was supposed to be. A bunch of other stuff, too."
Minnie peered into the wagon and nodded.
"Mm-hmm,"
she said.
"Yes, very good. Oh, very good." "So let's get going!" cried Kanza. "I'm starving!"
Dune got up out of the chair to take a closer look. In the wagon, he saw some lumpy sacks, and also what seemed at first to be a heap of wool. York reached in, and with a grunt lifted the wool in his arms. Dune saw a head, and legs hanging down. A sheep, he thought. No, a lamb. It was smaller than a full-grown sheep. And it didn't move. It was asleep or dead. Where had it come from? Had they gone up out of the cave to get it? Yorick and his father laid the lamb down on the pavement not far from where Dune was sitting. Minnie and Kanza stood nearby. From a bucket full of tools, Trog took a couple of long knives, and he and his son set to work cutting off the lamb's head. They cut off the 4 hooves next, kicking them aside, and then, with great wrenchings and gruntings, they peeled away the woolly skin until the lamb was a slippery red slab with stick-like stumps where the head and legs used to be. Dune knew that people ate animals. They never had in Ember. There were no animals there. But in Sparks, in the winter, his father had now and then brought home from the market some chunks of chewy, salty stuff that was called meat. Dune had been astonished when he was told it was made from animals, and had been saddened as well. The animals were new and fascinating creatures to him, and it was hard to accept that they were killed for food. Now, watching the trogs turn the lamb into meat, he had to press his hands against his mouth to keep from making a sound. While Trog was cutting up the lamb, Yorick and Kanza heaved the sacks out of the wagon and opened them. Inside were a lot of potatoes with dirt still on them, a few big, flabby cabbages, and several smaller sacks that Yorick peered into, announcing the contents of each.
Dried corn, some kind of beans, some kind of grain. Ew, mushrooms.
Kanza held up a small rag bundle.
This was on top of the rest, she said. It's tied in a knot.
Well, untie it, Pickle Nose,
said Trog, who was busy sticking the lamb's body onto the skewer over the fire. Kanza opened the bundle.
A rock, she said. We have enough rocks, if you ask me.
But something fluttered out, a scrap of paper. Kanza stooped to pick it up. She squinted at it.
It's a picture, she said. Look, Pa.
Trog came over to see. So did Minnie, hugging herself with her skinny arms as she passed Dune. Yorick peered over Kanza's shoulder, and Dune, too, clanked over to see.
There's words on it, said Yorick.
Someone else must have written them for her, Trog said. Strange.
Why would she want words? Who would be up there anyway? So what does it mean, Pa?
asked Kanza. Trog took the candle from his cap and held it near the paper.
It means,
he said. Then he was silent for a while.
It means she is going away.
Oh, alas, cried Minnie. Leaving us? For good?
Well, who knows, Trog said. Looks like it, though. She's waving.
But what about the words, Pa?
asked Kanza.
Pass it over to him, Trog said, nodding toward Dune. He likes to waste his time with words.
Kanza handed Dune the paper. Silently he read the message.
So,
said Kanza,
what does it say?
With an effort, Dune kept himself from smiling. He could see that Trog was listening, though he was pretending not to, so he had to think of something fast. He frowned over the words, as if he was having trouble making them out. The curly bits of the drawing were clearly sheep. The person who was dropping supplies from up above must be a shepherd. It did look as if the shepherd was waving goodbye. He thought of making up something that might help him, such as, "Release that boy immediately!" or "Get out! Bandits coming!" But he had to make the words go with the picture, or they wouldn't believe him. Best to play it safe, he finally decided.
It says, "Goodbye. I'm leaving. No more from me."
Minnie wailed.
Don't be an idiot, Trog said. Who cares? We've got enough for a long time. Don't forget what we found the other day.
Oh, yes,
said Minnie, cheering up. What did you find? asked Dune.
A little hole-in-the-wall shop over that way,
said Trog, waving a hand.
No sign on it or anything,
put in Kanza.
Nothing in front at all. Shelves empty. But the back room was absolutely crammed with good stuff, Trog said. Someone was hoarding.
Oh, said Dune, filing this information away in his mind. Excellent. All this time the lamb roasted over the fire, and a smell that Dune found part sickening and part delicious wafted toward him. At last, Trog and Minnie took the brown and glistening hulk down from its stick, and Trog set upon it again with a knife, carving it into chunks, which were snatched up with great gusto by his family, and bitten and gnawed until nothing was left but bones. They threw the bones in the fire and wiped their greasy faces on their sleeves. Dune ate the meat too. He was very hungry, but he still took the hot chunks from Trog with 2 fingers only, like something dangerous or repulsive. It had a rubbery texture and a greasy taste. He ate every bite.